Steve J. was not a rich man, but anyone who knew him would tell you he was one of the hardest working men in the city. Every morning before sunrise, Steve left his small rented room with his worn backpack and steel lunchbox. Sometimes he worked at construction sites. Other days he carried cement bags, unloaded trucks, or cleaned warehouses. The jobs were never permanent. The pay was never enough. But Steve had something stronger than comfort. He had purpose. And that purpose had a name: Jane. He met Jane 5 years earlier at a small roadside restaurant where she worked part-time. She was serving tea and bread when Steve first noticed her. Her smile was gentle, her voice soft, and her dreams big. Jane wanted to go to university, but life had not been kind to her family. Her parents could barely feed themselves, let alone pay school fees. Jane had almost given up on education completely, until Steve came into her life. Before we continue this emotional story, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes in love and sacrifice, and subscribe to Tales by Savvy Sam. Your support helps this channel grow and allows us to continue sharing powerful stories like this one. Now, back to Steve's story. Steve believed in Jane the moment he heard her talk about becoming a professional. He still remembered the night she said those words. "Steve, if I could just finish university, my life would change forever." Steve looked at her across the plastic table under the flickering restaurant light. In that moment, something inside him decided he would help her, even if it costs him everything. And it did. Steve began taking double shifts. If a construction supervisor asked who could stay overnight to finish a job, Steve was always the first to raise his hand. If someone needed a worker for Sunday labor, Steve showed up. If someone offered night security work for a small warehouse, Steve accepted. Sometimes he worked 18 hours a day. His hands became rough and cracked from lifting bricks and mixing cement. His back often ached so badly he struggled to sleep. But every time he received payment, he did the same thing. He transferred most of it to Jane's school account. School fees, books, transport, accommodation, even her laptop. Jane cried the first time Steve paid her tuition. "Why are you doing this for me?" she asked with tears in her eyes. Steve smiled and held her hands. "Because one day when you graduate, we will build our future together." Jane hugged him tightly. "I will never forget this, Steve. Never." And Steve believed her. For 4 years, Steve carried the weight of 2 lives. While Jane attended lectures, joined student clubs, and posted beautiful campus photos online, Steve worked under the hot sun carrying blocks and digging foundations. When Jane complained about exams, Steve comforted her. When Jane said she needed extra textbooks, Steve found a way. When Jane said she needed money for projects, Steve worked extra hours. He skipped meals. He wore the same clothes for years. He postponed every dream he had. All for Jane. His friends sometimes warned him, "Steve, be careful. People change." But Steve always defended her. "Jane is different," he would say confidently. "She appreciates everything." And for years, it seemed true. Until something began to change. Slowly at first. Jane's calls became less frequent. Her messages became shorter. Her replies came hours later. Sometimes days later. Steve tried not to worry. "She's probably busy with school," he told himself. But the silence kept growing. Then one day, Steve noticed something strange. His messages began showing blue ticks. Seen, but not replied. The first time it happened, he waited patiently. Then he waited longer. Then he waited days. Still nothing. Steve's heart began to feel heavy. He called her. No answer. He texted again. "Jane, are you okay?" Seen. No reply. 3 days later, Jane finally sent a message. "We need to talk." Steve felt relief wash over him. Finally. Maybe she had just been stressed. Maybe she needed support. Maybe she missed him. Steve immediately replied, "When can we meet?" Jane responded with a location. A very expensive hotel in the city. Steve had never even entered that hotel before. But he didn't hesitate. This is good, he thought. Maybe she wants to celebrate her graduation. Because yes, Jane had just graduated. And strangely, she never invited him. Steve had felt hurt about that. But he convinced himself there must be a reason. She will explain when we meet, he believed. So Steve prepared for the meeting as if it were the most important day of his life. He used part of his savings to buy a new shirt. He bought polished black shoes. He sprayed the best perfume he could afford. He even bought a beautiful bouquet of flowers. Then he made a reservation for a table for two at the hotel restaurant. The price alone made his heart shake. But he told himself it was worth it. Because tonight, he believed he would finally celebrate with the woman he loved. Steve arrived 1 hour early. The hotel lobby was beautiful and intimidating. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Soft piano music filled the air. People wearing expensive suits and dresses walked past him. Steve adjusted his collar nervously. He sat down at the reserved table. And waited. He checked his phone. No new message. 30 minutes passed. Then 40. Then 1 hour. Steve's heart began to pound. He texted Jane. "I'm here. Seen." No reply. Another 20 minutes passed. Then suddenly, Steve saw her. Jane walked into the restaurant. But she wasn't alone. She was holding the arm of a tall, well-dressed man wearing a luxury watch and an expensive suit. They walked confidently towards Steve's table. Steve stood up slowly, confused. His heart started racing. Jane looked at him calmly, but there was no warmth in her eyes anymore. The man beside her barely acknowledged Steve's existence. Jane spoke first. "Steve, thank you for coming." Steve forced a small smile. "Jane, who is this?" Jane looked at the man beside her and smiled. "This is Michael." Steve's stomach tightened. Then Jane said the words that shattered his world. "Michael is my fiancé." And in that moment, Steve realized the night he believed would be a celebration was actually the worst day of his life. For a few seconds after Jane spoke, Steve did not understand what he had just heard. The words floated in the air like a language his brain refused to translate. "Michael is my fiancé." Steve stood there with the bouquet still in his hand. His fingers slowly tightened around the flowers. The restaurant noise around him suddenly became distant, like he was underwater. People were talking, glasses were clinking, waiters were walking past, but Steve could barely hear any of it. He looked at Jane. Really looked at her. The same face he had loved for 5 years now felt unfamiliar. Her expression was calm. Too calm. Steve swallowed slowly. "Jane, what do you mean?" he asked quietly. Jane avoided his eyes. Michael pulled out a chair and sat down confidently like he owned the place. Jane sat beside him. Neither of them invited Steve to sit. Steve was still standing there like a stranger at his own table. Michael glanced briefly at Steve, then looked at Jane. "So, this is him?" Jane nodded slightly. Steve felt a sharp pain in his chest. This is him. Not Steve. Not the man who worked day and night. Not the man who paid her tuition. Just him. Steve slowly sat down across from them. His hands were shaking slightly. He placed the bouquet on the table, but now it looked foolish. Out of place. Like something meant for a different story. Jane cleared her throat. "Steve, I didn't want to do this over the phone." Steve let out a small laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the sound a man makes when reality becomes too painful to accept. "You didn't want to do this over the phone?" Steve repeated softly. "Jane, You didn't even invite me to your graduation." Jane shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Michael leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed. "I was busy," Jane said. Steve looked at her carefully. "Busy?" he whispered. His mind began replaying the last 4 years like a movie. The days he skipped meals so he could send her money. The nights he slept on the floor at construction sites after double shifts. The times he sold his own belongings just to help her pay school fees. And now she was saying she was busy. Steve felt something inside him crack. "You said we were building a future," he said quietly. Jane sighed. "Steve, people grow." That sentence hit him harder than a slap. People grow. Steve nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "I know." He looked around the luxurious restaurant. Crystal lights. Expensive wine. Elegant guests. Then he looked down at his own hands. Rough. Scarred. The hands of a laborer. Suddenly, he understood something painful. Jane had not just changed. She had outgrown him. Or at least, that was what she believed. Michael spoke for the first time. His voice was smooth and confident. "Look, Steve, right?" Steve did not answer. Michael continued anyway. "Jane told me you helped her during school. That was nice of you." "Nice." Steve slowly lifted his head. "Nice. 4 years of sacrifice. Reduced to nice." Michael continued. "But things are different now. Jane has a future ahead of her. A big one." Steve stared at him silently. Michael adjusted his expensive watch. "I run several companies. Jane will be working with me soon." Jane nodded proudly. Steve felt the room spin slightly. "So that's it?" Steve asked quietly. Jane finally looked at him. "Yes, Steve." Her voice was firm now. "We're just in different places in life." Steve stared at her for a long time. 5 years. 5 years of memories. 5 years of believing. 5 years of love. And it was ending like a business meeting. Steve looked down at the table again. Then he noticed something that made his chest tighten. Jane was wearing a ring. A large diamond ring. Steve remembered the small promise ring he gave her years ago. She used to wear it every day. It was gone. Replaced. Just like him. Steve suddenly felt very tired. Not just physically, but emotionally. Like a man who had been carrying a heavy load for years. And suddenly realized it was all for nothing. "Do you love him?" Steve asked quietly. Jane hesitated. Then she answered. "Yes." The word echoed inside Steve's head. Michael smiled slightly. Steve nodded slowly. "I see." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened his bank app. His fingers moved slowly across the screen. Then he turned the phone toward Jane. "That was the last transfer I made to your school account," he said softly. Jane looked at the screen. The number was large. Years of payments. Years of sacrifice. Michael leaned forward and glanced at it too. For the first time, his expression changed slightly. Jane looked uncomfortable. "Steve, I didn't ask you to do all that," she said quietly. That sentence hit Steve like a knife. "You didn't ask," he repeated. His voice trembled slightly now. "Jane, every semester you called me crying about school fees." Jane said nothing. "Every project, every textbook, every hostel payment." His voice cracked. "I was there." The people at nearby tables had started noticing the tension. Steve suddenly realized something humiliating. He had spent more money than he could afford just to sit in this restaurant and hear his heart break. A waiter approached the table politely. "Sir, would you like to order?" Steve looked at the menu. The cheapest item was more than what he usually spent on food in 3 days. Steve closed the menu. "No," he said quietly. Jane spoke softly. "Steve, I hope you understand someday." Steve looked at her. His eyes were red now. But he refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. Not in front of strangers. Instead, he did something unexpected. He smiled. It was a small, broken smile. "I understand perfectly," he said. Then he stood up. He picked up the bouquet of flowers. For a moment, he considered leaving them on the table. But then he changed his mind. He walked past their table, past the chandeliers, past the wealthy guests, past the life he thought he was building, and out into the cold night air. Outside the hotel, Steve stood alone under the streetlight. The city noise surrounded him. Cars passed. People laughed. Life continued. But Steve felt like his world had stopped. He looked down at the flowers in his hand. Then slowly, he placed them in a nearby trash bin. And for the first time in years, Steve allowed himself to cry. The night Steve left the hotel, he did not go home immediately. He walked, and walked, and walked. The city lights blurred as tears filled his eyes. Every step felt heavy, like his legs were carrying not just his body, but the weight of 5 broken years. The cold night air touched his face, but he barely felt it. His mind replayed the same moment again and again. "Michael is my fiancé." Those words echoed inside his head like a cruel song that refused to stop. By the time Steve reached his small rented room, it was almost midnight. He opened the door slowly and stepped inside. The room looked the same as always. A thin mattress, a small fan that barely worked, a wooden chair, and a metal locker where he kept his few belongings. But something felt different. The room suddenly looked like a place built for sacrifice. On the small table beside his bed were old bank receipts and transfer slips, proof of every payment he had made for Jane's school fees. Steve stared at them silently. Then slowly, he sat down. For a long time, he said nothing. Then finally, he whispered to himself, "What did I do wrong?" The question hung in the air, but no answer came. Steve lay down on the mattress and stared at the ceiling. Sleep did not come easily that night. His heart felt like it had been emptied. Everything he had worked for, everything he believed in, had disappeared in one evening. But sometime before dawn, a different thought slowly formed in his mind. A painful thought, but also a powerful one. If I could work this hard for someone else's future. He sat up slowly. What would happen if I worked this hard for my own? That thought stayed with him. The next morning, Steve did something unexpected. He deleted Jane's phone number. Then he deleted her pictures. Then he deleted their old messages. Each delete felt like tearing a piece of his heart. But he did it anyway, because he knew something important. If he kept looking back, he would never move forward. Steve didn't make any dramatic speeches. He didn't post sad messages online. He didn't beg Jane to return. Instead, he disappeared. Not from life, but from the past that had been holding him down. Steve stopped talking about Jane, stopped explaining his pain, stopped telling people his story. He simply worked. But this time, something was different. Before, Steve worked to support Jane's dreams. Now he worked to build his own life. At first, nothing changed. He still carried cement, still unloaded trucks, still worked under the same burning sun. But Steve began observing things he had never paid attention to before. He watched how contractors managed projects. He studied how suppliers negotiated prices. He listened carefully when engineers discussed construction plans. Slowly, Steve began learning. Every evening after work, he borrowed books about construction and business from a small public library. He watched online tutorials whenever he could afford mobile data. Sometimes he studied late into the night, his tired eyes struggling to stay open. But something inside him had awakened. A quiet determination. Years passed. Slowly, Steve's life began to change. A contractor he once worked for noticed his dedication and promoted him to site supervisor. The pay improved slightly. But more importantly, Steve gained experience. He saved every extra coin he could. He avoided unnecessary spending. He continued learning. Then one day, an opportunity came. A small building project needed someone to coordinate workers and manage materials. The contractor trusted Steve enough to recommend him. Steve was nervous, but he accepted. That small project became the turning point of his life. Steve managed the work carefully. He treated the workers with respect. He negotiated fair prices with suppliers. And most importantly, he finished the project on time. The client was impressed. Soon, another project came. Then another. Years continued passing. The skinny laborer who once carried cement bags slowly transformed into a confident construction entrepreneur. Steve eventually registered a small company. It wasn't huge, but it was growing. And something even more important had changed. Steve was no longer the same man who sat alone in that hotel restaurant years ago. The pain had not completely disappeared, but it had become something else. Strength. One afternoon, nearly 6 years later, Steve stood in front of a newly completed office building. Workers were putting the final touches on the project. Steve wore a clean suit now. Not expensive, but respectable. A young engineer walked up to him. "Sir, the client will arrive soon for inspection." Steve nodded calmly. "Good. Let's make sure everything is perfect." Just then, a black luxury car pulled into the parking lot. Steve barely paid attention. Cars like that often belong to clients. But when the door opened, Steve froze. A woman stepped out of the car. At first, he didn't recognize her. But when she turned around, his heart skipped a beat. It was Jane. But she looked different. Her face no longer carried the confident glow he remembered. Instead, she looked tired, worried, and older than her years. Jane slowly looked around the construction site. Then her eyes landed on Steve. For a moment, both of them stood frozen. Time seemed to pause. 6 years of silence suddenly stood between them. Jane's eyes widened in shock. Steve. Steve remained calm. But inside his chest, old memories began to stir. The hotel. The flowers. The broken promises. Jane slowly walked toward him. Her voice trembled slightly. I didn't know this was your project." Steve looked at her quietly. Then he replied with calm dignity. "Neither did I." Jane lowered her eyes. For the first time in many years, the woman who once walked into that hotel with pride now looked like someone carrying regret. But Steve had changed. The man she once left behind was no longer the same man standing in front of her. And fate had just brought them back together again. For several seconds, neither Steve nor Jane spoke. The busy construction site suddenly felt strangely quiet. Workers were moving around, machines were humming, people were talking. But for Steve and Jane, it felt like the world had paused. Jane stood a few steps away from him, her hands slightly trembling. 6 years. 6 long years had passed since the night she walked into that luxury hotel holding another man's arm. And now she stood here again. But the woman in front of Steve was not the same confident graduate he remembered. Her expensive clothes were gone. Her face looked pale and tired. There were faint lines of stress around her eyes. And the bright, proud energy she once carried had disappeared. Jane tried to smile, but the smile was weak. "You look different," she said softly. Steve nodded politely. "Life changes people." Jane looked down at the ground. "Yes," she whispered. "It does." An awkward silence followed. Steve's mind was calm, but deep inside, memories were quietly resurfacing. He remembered the hotel, the flowers in the trash bin, the long walk home, The night he cried under the streetlight. But strangely, the pain no longer felt sharp. It felt distant, like a wound that had healed long ago. Steve spoke calmly. "So, what brings you here?" Jane hesitated. Her eyes moved around the construction site nervously. Then she finally said the words she had been holding inside. "I came to ask for work." Steve blinked. For a moment, he thought he had heard wrong. "Work?" Jane nodded slowly. "Yes." Steve studied her face carefully. Something about her expression looked broken. Not proud. Not confident. Broken. "What happened?" Steve asked quietly. Jane let out a long breath. Then she looked up at him again. "You remember Michael, right?" Steve nodded once. "Yes." Jane looked away. Her voice became heavier. 3 years after we got married, everything collapsed." Steve listened silently. Jane continued. "Michael's businesses started failing. At first, it was just one company. Then another." Her hands tightened together nervously. "Then the investigations started." Steve frowned slightly. "Investigations?" Jane nodded. "Yes. Government investigations." The construction noises around them continued, but Steve's attention remained fixed on Jane. "He had taken huge loans," Jane explained. "Money he couldn't repay. He was moving funds illegally between companies, hiding losses, lying to investors." Steve remained quiet. Jane's voice began shaking slightly. Eventually everything exploded. She swallowed hard. The companies collapsed. The investors sued him. The banks froze his accounts. Steve slowly crossed his arms. "And you?" Jane laughed bitterly. "At first, I thought we would survive it. I believed him when he said everything would be okay." She paused. "But when the lawsuits started, Michael disappeared." Steve's eyes narrowed slightly. "Disappeared?" Jane nodded. "One morning he packed a suitcase, said he needed to travel for business. And he never came back." The words hung heavily in the air. Jane continued softly. "I later found out he left the country." Steve felt a strange mix of emotions. Not happiness. Not revenge. Just quiet understanding. "And the debts?" he asked. Jane's eyes filled with tears. "They came after everything. The house. The cars. The savings. All gone." Steve said nothing. Jane wiped her eyes quickly. "I had no work experience. I had never really worked after graduation because Michael promised I wouldn't need to." She gave a sad smile. "I trusted him." Steve looked at her carefully. Life had clearly been harsh to her. Jane took a deep breath. "After everything collapsed, I tried to find work. But most companies didn't want to hire someone connected to Michael's scandal." She looked around the construction site again. Then her eyes returned to Steve. "I heard about your company recently." Her voice was small now. "When I saw the project address today, I didn't know it was you." Steve nodded slowly. Jane looked at him nervously. "I know I probably don't deserve help from you." The sentence was heavy with regret. "But I thought, maybe." Her voice faded. Steve waited. Jane finally forced herself to say it. "Maybe you could give me a job." Silence followed. A long silence. Steve looked at the building behind him. The building he had spent months constructing. Brick by brick. Decision by decision. Effort by effort. Then he looked back at Jane. He remembered the day he once sat across from her with flowers in his hand. The day she told him he was no longer enough. Now the situation had reversed. But Steve did not feel powerful. He simply felt older, wiser, and calmer. He spoke slowly. "What kind of job are you looking for?" Jane looked surprised. "Anything," she said quickly. "Office work, assistant, even basic administration. Steve thought for a moment. Then he said something Jane did not expect. "You're educated." Jane nodded slowly. "Yes." Steve looked toward the office trailer nearby. "I might have something." Jane's eyes widened slightly. "Really?" Steve raised a hand gently. "But Jane..." She froze. Steve's voice remained calm but firm. "This is not about the past." Jane nodded quickly. "I understand." Steve continued. "If you work here, you will be treated like every other employee. No special treatment. No shortcuts." Jane's eyes filled with tears again. "That's more than fair," she said softly. Steve looked at her one last time. The woman who once broke his heart now stood in front of him, asking for help. Life had come full circle. But Steve had learned something important over the years. Bitterness destroys the person carrying it. And he had worked too hard to rebuild his life. He extended his hand toward the office trailer. "Come," he said calmly. "Let's talk to the manager." Jane stared at him with disbelief. Then slowly, she followed him. But inside her heart, one painful truth echoed loudly. The man she once left behind had become the man she should never have lost. Jane worked at Steve's company for nearly a year. At first, the adjustment was difficult for her. The woman who once lived in luxury apartments and rode in expensive cars now woke up early every morning to arrive at the office before 8 a.m. She handled paperwork, answered emails, filed construction documents. Sometimes she stayed late organizing reports and invoices. There were no private drivers, no designer clothes, no glamorous parties, just work. Simple, honest work. And strangely, it slowly began to heal her. For the first time in many years, Jane was building something with her own effort. But every single day she saw something that reminded her of the past. Steve. He moved through the company with calm confidence. Workers respected him. Managers listened to him. Clients trusted him. The same man who once carried cement bags under the sun was now the one leading projects worth millions. But Steve was different from the man she used to know. He was kind, professional, fair, but distant. Very distant. He never mentioned the past. Never spoke about the hotel night. Never asked about Michael again. And most painfully, he treated Jane exactly the same as every other employee. Nothing more. Nothing less. At first, Jane thought time would change things. She believed maybe one day Steve would soften. Maybe he would remember the love they once shared. Maybe there was still a chance. But as the months passed, Jane began to realize something difficult. Steve had truly moved on. Not with anger. Not with revenge. But with peace. One afternoon, Jane stayed late in the office finishing some documents. The building was quiet. Most employees had already gone home. She stood by the window, looking out at the sunset over the construction site. Suddenly, she heard laughter outside. Jane looked down toward the parking area. And what she saw made her heart stop. Steve was standing beside a car. And next to him was a woman. They were talking and laughing together. The woman looked warm, confident, and kind. She held Steve's hand naturally, like it belonged there. Jane felt her chest tighten. She had never seen Steve smile like that before. Not even during the years they were together. A colleague walked past Jane and noticed her looking outside. "Oh, you're seeing them," the colleague said casually. Jane tried to sound calm. "Who is she?" The colleague smiled. "That's Amara." Jane forced a small nod. "His girlfriend." The colleague laughed. "Girlfriend? No." Jane's heart skipped. The colleague continued. "She's his fiancée." The word hit Jane like thunder. Fiancé. The same word she once used to break Steve's heart. Jane looked back outside. Steve opened the car door for Amara like a gentleman. They spoke softly for a moment. Then Amara laughed again and touched his arm affectionately. The happiness between them looked natural, peaceful, real. Jane felt tears forming in her eyes. Not loud tears. Not dramatic tears. Just quiet ones. The kind that comes when a person finally understands the consequences of their choices. Later that evening, Jane was packing her bag when Steve walked into the office. He had returned briefly to collect some documents. Jane hesitated for a moment. Then she spoke. "Steve." He turned calmly. "Yes." Jane struggled to find the words. But she knew she had to say them. "I saw you earlier, with your fiancé." Steve nodded slightly. "Yes." Jane forced a small smile. "She seems wonderful." Steve's expression softened slightly. "She is." There was a short silence. Then Jane finally spoke the truth that had lived in her heart for years. "Steve, I'm sorry." Steve looked at her quietly. Jane continued, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry for everything. For the hotel. For the way I treated you. For forgetting everything you did for me." Her eyes filled with tears. "I was foolish. I thought money and status were the most important things." She wiped her face gently. "But life taught me a very hard lesson." Steve listened calmly. Jane looked at him with deep regret. "I lost the best man who ever loved me." The office became silent. Steve thought for a moment. Then he spoke softly. "Jane, life is a teacher." Jane nodded slowly. "Yes." Steve continued. "But we all learn our lessons at different times." Jane lowered her eyes. "And sometimes too late," she whispered. Steve didn't disagree. Instead, he said something simple. "I hope you find happiness again." Jane nodded quietly. "Thank you for giving me this job." Steve gave a small, respectful nod. "You earned it." He picked up the documents he had come for. Then he walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he paused. "Take care of yourself, Jane." And then he left. Jane stood alone in the quiet office. The room felt heavy with memories. But this time, she understood something clearly. Steve had once built her future. But she had destroyed their future. And now, the life she once rejected had become someone else's happiness. Jane slowly walked to the window again. Outside, Steve's car drove away into the evening sunset. Next to him was the woman who would share his future. Jane watched until the car disappeared from view. Then she whispered softly to herself, "Too late." If this story touched your heart, remember that love, sacrifice, and loyalty should never be taken for granted. Sometimes, the people who build our future are the very people we lose because we fail to value them. Before you leave, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to Tales by Savvy Sam for more powerful and emotional stories like this one. Your support helps us continue telling stories that inspire, teach, and remind us about the true value of people in our lives.